Shabbat Shalom. Pesachim 22b. It's a Talmudic citation. So once about 45 years ago, sometime during my first year in rabbinical school, I was invited to give a guest sermon at Har Shalom, where I had spent my college years. Well, a first-year rabbinical student is good at writing sermons, or so we thought at least. And in retrospect, all these years later, I think that sermon was a pretty good one. I do remember that I quoted at least one Talmudic passage, including the citation. And later, at Shabbat lunch, Rabbi Kahan gave me his critique of the sermon. He was appropriately complimentary, but my mentor offered a few criticisms and suggestions as well. One of which was, I don't know if you really needed to mention Pesachim 22b. So one of the lessons that I learned that Shabbat, at least one of the lessons that I started to learn, is that one should not quote too many classical sources in a sermon, and it's unnecessary to cite most of the sources explicitly. Now, all these years later, I still tend to quote classical sources a little too much in sermons, I think, but I think I'm better at not citing chapter and verse, or in this case, tractate and page number, too explicitly. I tend to put sources in footnotes, and those of you who have studied with me in the Skolnick Institute or in my independent study group, and those of you who know my handouts know that I do love my footnotes. So much for Pesachim 22b, so let's just put that in a footnote. That was the preface to the sermon, not the sermon itself. Because somebody told me I'm supposed to stall a little bit because, I don't know, the quiche isn't warm enough yet or something like that. So, in the upside-down, post-factual world that we live in, it's hard to know what's what anymore. Factual assertions no longer carry the weight they once did, interpretive assertions even less, and our conceptual assumptions about the world we live in are no longer considered reliable. Freedom of religion. Freedom of religion, one of the fundamental pillars of American law and American society. Most elementary school students have at least a vague notion that freedom of religion is a central American value, one of the principles codified in the First Amendment of the Constitution. And the First Amendment guarantees our right to be free from government sanction or interference in our religious lives. And we Jews have a long history and a particular vested interest in the First Amendment. However, recent years have seen a significant perversion of the American notion of freedom of religion. This has been going on for a while, and I don't blame the current administration and its political movement alone for this corruption, although the MAGA crowd has embraced it and furthered it. Kimberly Davis. Kimberly Davis was the county clerk in Rowan County, Kentucky, who in 2015 refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples in defiance of the Supreme Court's Obergefell versus Hodges decision. And in so doing, she became the poster child for the recent distortion of the First Amendment notion of religious freedom to mean my right to impose my religious perspective on other people. That's the perversion, the notion that my religious freedom gives me the right to impose my religion on others. Now, this distortion isn't really so recent. It has been in operation for half a century in the realm of reproductive rights, with the ongoing campaign to try to impose the position of the Roman Catholic Church and of white evangelical churches on the rest of us. And now this perversion of the notion of religious freedom is seen in the realm of marriage rights as well. Well, the good news is that ultimately Kimberly Davis failed in her crusade to banish same-sex marriage from Rowan County. She was sued, and her defense, ascending ultimately to the Supreme Court, failed. However, her legal failure became a bit of a political success in some circles. Mike Huckabee, yes, that Mike Huckabee, called the legal battle the criminalization of Christianity. And I think that most reasonable people were happy about the legal failure of this attempt to impose Kim Davis's religious principles on the rest of us. Do you disapprove of same-sex marriage based either on religious grounds or on simple prejudice or on some combination of the two? That is certainly your prerogative. But the Obergefell decision guaranteed marriage equality, at least until the Supreme Court takes that right away. So you cannot legitimately take a job as a government functionary and then use that governmental power to deny a couple's right to get married. You don't want to issue same-sex marriage licenses when the law mandates marriage equality? Fine, get another job. But I've been asking myself in recent years, is there in Jewish law and Jewish values something to this? Can a Jewish county clerk, for example, who believes that Jewish law forbids intermarriage, refuse on the grounds of religious freedom to issue a marriage license to an interfaith couple? It's an important question. My First Amendment rights afford me, as a rabbi, the choice to officiate or not to officiate at a same-sex marriage ceremony. But a Jewish county clerk does not have an analogous right because a government official does not have the right to impose his or her religious sensibility on others. The First Amendment forbids it. And so the conflicted Jewish county clerk would also just have to find a different job. And yet, one of my favorite mitzvot, that is one of the mitzvot that I find most intriguing, is known as Lifnei Iver. That's a shorthand name. The full mitzvah is V'lifnei Iver lo titein michshol. You shall not put a stumbling block before the blind. Now, Jewish law has long applied this prohibition quite broadly, so much that, a Talmud professor once told me, medieval rabbinic literature reflects some uncertainty about whether this mitzvah actually applies to placing a physical impediment in front of a person who is visually impaired. The rabbis were so used to applying the prohibition of Lifnei Iver so far beyond its literal meaning that by the Middle Ages they weren't sure if the literal meaning still applied. So what does Lifnei Iver prohibit? Well, numerous things. According to the rabbis, it prohibits giving what one knows. According to the rabbis, it prohibits giving what one knows is bad advice, misleading someone whom Rashi describes as sumab b'davar, blind concerning a specific matter. But sometimes we can violate Lifnei Iver by failing to do something. So, for example, Lifnei Iver also prohibits leaving a grave unmarked, possibly misleading someone who might inadvertently tread on that unmarked grave. Lifnei Iver forbids purposely making someone lose his or her temper. And interestingly, the Talmud especially addresses the issue of angering one's grown children. The Talmud tells the story of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's housekeeper, who one day saw a man hitting his grown son. The man should be excommunicated, she said, because he was violating Lifnei Iver, possibly provoking the son to hit his father back, thereby causing the son to violate the mitzvah to honor one's parents and the specific admonition, Umakeh avi v'imo mot yumat, one who strikes one's father or mother shall be put to death. The housekeeper's insight is codified both by Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah and by Karo in the Shulchan Aruch. And I remember reading about it when I was a young teenager, reading about it probably in what was my Shabbos afternoon reading, a book with the title Code of Jewish Law. It was the 1930s English translation of the 1860s Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and it was the only halachic guidance that was available in print to a 14-year-old who had a limited Jewish text background. And sometimes things become garbled in translation or in years of fading recollection. Now, I was an odd boy. Sometimes I would mix up similar names and similar words. For example, I used to confuse Sophia Loren and Sophie Tucker. And I vaguely remember one Shabbos afternoon reading the following. One may chastise one's young son, but one must not chastise one's grown son because the son might get angry and hit his father. But what I thought I was reading was, one may castrate one's young son, but one must not castrate one's grown son because the son might get angry and hit his father. And at that age, I had not even heard of Oedipus. Now, one interesting application of Lifnei Iver is a halachic concept known as Marit Ayin, appearances. It's also known by its Ashkenazic Yiddish pronunciation, Maris Ayin, and a lot of people have this vague idea that they have this Yiddish-speaking great uncle named Morris Ayin. So Morris Ayin is a well-known concept in a lot of Jewish families. Marit Ayin is the prohibition of doing something that might not be prohibited, but that might mislead another person anyway. For example, should a Jew who generally wears a kippah in public keep that kippah on when going into a non-kosher restaurant to eat a vegetarian meal? Or might the kippah mislead someone to assume that the restaurant is kosher? V'lifnei iver lo titein michshol, you shall not put a stumbling block before the blind. My wife used to joke about my Marit Ayin flip of the wrist back in the day. But this brings to mind the most compelling part of Lifnei Iver, and it gets complicated, it gets tricky here. In the Talmud, and can you guess where in the Talmud? Pesachim 22b, you're right. So there on Pesachim 22b, Rabbi Natan asks, Minayin shelo yoshit adam kos yayin lenazir. From where do we know that one must not extend a cup of wine to a nazir? A nazir, known in English as a Nazirite, is someone who has taken an oath to, among other things, refrain from drinking wine. At first glance, Rabbi Natan's question doesn't make a lot of sense. If I have a guest who's a Nazir, and I'm serving a wonderful bottle of wine to my guests, what's the harm in offering him some? If he says no thank you, it's good that he exercised self-control and he kept his oath. But if he decides to violate his oath, that's between himself and God. No, say the rabbis, if I offer wine to a Nazir and he accepts it, the primary sin is on the head of the man who violated his oath, but because of Lifnei Iver, I share some responsibility for facilitating his transgression. And elsewhere in the Talmud, and I won't tell you that it's on Avodah Zarah 66b, because we're not supposed to oversight our sources, the rabbis tighten the prohibition slightly, and the preponderance of rabbinic opinion is that Lifnei Iver prohibits facilitating someone's aveirah, someone's violation. But a case can be made for a broader application of Lifnei Iver, as if to say to the would-be transgressor, you want to do the wrong thing? Fine. But don't expect me to be a party to your act. Don't expect me to go along with your right choice. So Lifnei Iver can prohibit facilitating someone's aveirah, and also can prohibit facilitating going along with someone's aveirah. Lifnei Iver is an important mitzvah because it has many different facets, many different applications, and I believe it has absolutely no application in a secular court of law, to allow someone's religious principles to outweigh their secular legal obligations. Sorry, Kim Davis, you should have resigned your position in Rowan County. But you and I are not county clerks, at least as far as I'm aware. We don't have any county clerks among us. And Lifnei Iver is an important mitzvah, not only for would-be county clerks. It challenges us to cultivate an acute awareness of the influence that we have on other people. When I was in USY, one Hebrew word that was a common part of our USY vocabularies was dugma, example. We USY leaders were frequently admonished by the grown-ups, you have an obligation to be a good dugma. And in fact, it's not only USY leaders who have this obligation, we all do. We all are obligated to be good dugmaot and to avoid being bad dugmaot. Lifnei Iver challenges us all to avoid facilitating or going along with other people's transgressions. And it also challenges us to be positive role models, to attempt in unassuming and non-judgmental ways to model proper Jewish behavior to the enhancement of our own Jewish lives and to the enhancement of the Jewish lives of those around us. Shabbat Shalom.